The world, although well lighted with fluorescence and incandescent bulbs and neon, is still full of odd dark corners and unsettling nooks and crannies, said Stephen King in the Firestarter. A thriller about a young girl named Charlie McGee and her father, Andy McGee, on the run from a government agency called the Shop. The reason they're on the run is due to their abnormal psionic characteristics. Andy is able to push people and change their thoughts with only his mind, while Charlie is able to start fires with just a thought. The Shop's agents lead them on a thrilling chase along the eastern side of the US, during which the two must use their psionic abilities to thwart them wherever possible. The reason that King's quote is so closely related to the story is because Andy and his wife, Vicky, were results of a government experiment codenamed Lot 6, in which they were injected with a drug of the same name. Most of the participants of the experiment died. However, Andy and Vicky survived, gaining limited psionic ability. Their daughter Charlie, of course, had their abilities but amplified. In other words, Andy and his wife are one of those dark corners or unsettling nooks and crannies that the government doesn't want the world to see. The story really focuses on the importance of the father-daughter bond between Andy and Charlie. For example, at the beginning of the story, Andy runs out of money, and he has to explain to Charlie how to steal from a payphone. Charlie is only 7 at the time, and so she asks her father why stealing is okay in this scenario. And watching Andy explain to Charlie how they have no money is probably one of the most emotionally touching moments in the book, because it's something that a father never wants to tell his daughter. And King develops the scene in a way so that even if you can't relate to the situation at all, you can still feel Andy's grief as he's forced to tell his daughter to take from other people. Later in the story, Andy and Charlie do finally run out of money and ways to escape the Shop, and it's kind of an inevitability that they would eventually get captured. Once the two are captured, they're separated and made to live in separate apartments. Although they're kept in good condition, they will be kept there until they're willing to undergo testing to determine the cause and effect of their psionic abilities. During this time, Charlie refuses to be tested, no matter what, as in the past, her abilities had gotten out of control and set fire to things she didn't mean to. In one scene, however, a man named John Rainbird acted as a cleaning man and came into Charlie's apartment to talk to her and try and get her to agree to experiments. This scene is genius because it's being told from the perspective of Rainbird, so we can hear his thought process as he tries to manipulate Charlie into agreeing to being a test subject. And even more beautifully, King says that the chisel slips in another notch every time Rainbird successfully gets her to open up about things that have been going on with her powers and her life and her father. And so it paints this really beautiful picture of just like an actual chisel boring into Charlie's head and revealing all this information. And it's not a scene that I'm going to forget anytime soon. This was also the point in the book where I for sure knew how it would end. As I said earlier, the government and the Shop did not want to keep these psionic freaks, as they said, alive, as they posed a hazard to like the safe and like working order of society. So once they did testing and figured out why these abilities were caused, what reason did they have to keep Andy and Charlie alive, essentially? And that's kind of amazing because you know at this point that the ending's going to be tragic. Even if they do survive, something will be lost. For my honest opinion on this book, I'd say it's really great. King does a really good job of building suspense. That's one of the staples in most of his books, especially like some of the thriller and horror ones. And it really is just all building towards the ending. And there's plot points that are foreshadowed from the very beginning of the book that you don't realize were foreshadowed until the end. And at that point, you can kind of look back and say, oh, I knew this would happen, even though it was something that was like a minor detail. Another great thing about the book is the relationship between the characters. I've already talked about the relationship between Andy and Charlie being a great father and daughter relationship, but there's other ones, such as the relationship between John Rainbird and Charlie, because it's kind of seated on a throne of lies, as in Rainbird's lying to Charlie to get her to open up about her experiences. There's a bunch of other relationships like this that are really in-depth, and they kind of give the book like an overall realistic feel. One of the things I believe, however, is missing from the book is an explanation as to why Andy and Charlie don't just turn themselves over to the Shop. In the beginning, they're not really a malicious organization, and honestly, if they would have submitted to study earlier, they probably could have resisted a lot of unnecessary suffering and potentially even both come out alive if they determined that the two weren't dangerous enough to be actual threats to the democracy. This is kind of negated by the fact that they killed Vicky, Andy's wife, but after they'd been captured, I don't see any reason aside from spite for them to have resisted experimentation, especially if they would have gotten out of there sooner, like I said. The only other thing about this book is that the beginning is a little bit slow. Like, it took me about 2 weeks to read the beginning, and then once I got past that, after that, it took me about 2 days to read the entire second half, and I consider myself a pretty fast reader, so it might take other people longer. But overall, it's a great story. I would definitely recommend it. Everything's just developed in such a nice way, and it's just a great book.